I'd like to ask them to start with their observation, understanding of the current international environment or strategic landscape with a specific focus on the arrival of the strongman era in authoritarian regime. I'd like to start with Mr. Montbrial, please.
Well, thank you very much. My first remark would be, why are we talking of strong men and not strong women? Historically, Mrs. Thatcher, for instance, was really a strong woman, and there are many examples of that sort. No, more seriously, I think that this is not a new problem. In traditional language, the issue is what is a good government? And in the mid-90s, for instance, this issue was widely discussed in the context of so-called Asian values. And I remember having myself had many discussions with Lee Kuan Yew, the very famous leader of Singapore, who was an eloquent defender of strong leaders. And what is today, for instance, you could give a number of examples. President Kagame, for instance, from Rwanda, of course, he's criticized on some human rights issue, etc., but nobody can deny that he has achieved a remarkable development of his country, Rwanda. So the question, and that my next point, is why, what is the trade-off, if one can speak about that, between authoritarian regimes, strong governments, and democracy? These terms are not very well defined, by the way. I think the trade-off is between legitimacy and efficiency. Legitimacy is about the consensus of the population as a whole on a certain kind of political regime. Efficiency has to do with decision-making, that is, thinking strategically, and delivering, that is, achieving the goals, you know, and often in a long-term perspective, not in a day-to-day perspective. And if you think in long-term wise, the two, legitimacy and efficiency, have to move together. It's not possible for a legitimate government to remain legitimate indefinitely if they cannot deliver, and vice versa. This is why today all people tend to oversimplify issues. For instance, with what I like to call the Biden, you know, is the guy who is president of the United States. I don't know if he always knows he is, but he is the president of the United States. And I call the Biden dichotomy, that is to present the global situation as the coalition of the good guys, namely democracies, against the bad guys, namely autocracies, whatever they are defined. I think this is a wrong way to put the problem. And in fact, if you look at Brazil, for instance, the current president, Lula, was considered as a good guy by everybody until he took some positions that the West disliked about Putin and about Ukraine. And I would also like to remember Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great author and dissident of the Soviet regime, who made a very famous speech at Harvard University on, I think it was June 8, 1978. The title of the speech was The Decline of Courage. And he criticized massively the values of the West, you know, and talking about our decline. That was in 1978. And that was a man that before everybody had praised in the West. I happened recently to study relatively carefully to look relatively carefully at the Crimea War in the middle of the 19th century. You know, that was a very big war where the French and the British in particular were heavily involved against Russia and to support Turkey at the time, the Ottoman Empire. And when you look at the details, you recognize many of the features of the current situation about the future of the Black Sea. So, and this has very little to do with democracy as such. So we should think much deeper about these issues and do not subscribe to the Biden dichotomy without being more critical in our approach.
Thank you, Mr. Monbrias. Actually, he raised the issue of the Biden dichotomy. I'd like to ask Dr. Feulner to make some comments about the world situation, especially with the specific focus on strongmen. Actually, this is not the first time, but actually in our history, there are era of strongmen. So, please.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Che. Today is September 14th?
Yeah, 14th.
3 days ago, in the United States, there was a coming together, because it was 22 years of remembering what happened on 9/11. And I say that because the title of our session really is Democracy Really in Retreat? And like so many other Americans, I well remember what happened 22 years and 3 days ago, and the incredible reaction in the United States of everyone coming together, of unanimity that we are all one people, no matter what color, what gender. We were all Americans. We had all been attacked, and it brought us together. Since that time, there have been obviously differences in terms of political outlooks, in terms of which way to go, where we should be heading, and that's part of the big challenge that we face. But the chairman, I think, said it well when he said, strong man or strong leaders is not something new. It's very hard for me to sit between a French leader of a think tank and a British leader of a think tank and not think about de Gaulle and Churchill, and here I am, FDR in the middle. You know, and who were we against? Arguably the strongest opponent in recent, last several centuries, Adolf Hitler on the other side. So the notion that somehow strongmen, a Xi of China, a Putin of Russia, Kim Jong-un, and the Ayatollah, what some of us in Washington now call the new axis of evil, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Yes, these are ongoing political issues, political in those terms, really political conflicts. And you know, in the United States, whether it's Biden or Trump or whoever it is, there's a recognition on pretty much a bipartisan basis that there are good people and bad people in the world and good people and bad people in charge. And so it's not really a whole new question. So I just would leave it that way, that those of us who are involved in what I call as think tank leaders in the war of ideas, we have not only to think about questions like that, we also have to think about some of the other great themes that have been explored over the last 2.5 days here, like artificial intelligence. If you're running a think tank, and one of my exalted title now is founder of the Heritage Foundation, because I'm the only one who's still alive who signed the original documents 50 years and 3 months ago. And 50 years ago, we all talked about mimeograph machines. There was no internet. Today, if you're very clever using the internet and abusing the system, suddenly you can come out and pronounce something that Theories Institute or Chatham House or Heritage thinks is absolute insanity. But if you get it on the internet and somehow you get enough amplification of it, or you use artificial intelligence to propose it further, boy, all of a sudden the whole world's changed in terms of how you do these debates, in terms of who's ahead. And these are new challenges that we face. It's a new era, is all I'm saying. And the whole question of strongmen has always been something we've had to deal with. And we just have to hope that people who believe in freedom and in the rule of law, equally applied to everyone, will come together, stay together, and counter some of these evil influences that are out there.
Thank you,
Mr.
Dr.
Chairman.
Fuller. So, Robin, please, your view.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Wonderful to be back at the World Knowledge Forum, and as my colleagues here were saying, to see such a great audience and a young audience as well. And this is one of the big questions out there. What is going on with the rise of autocracies? I think there's two sides to the coin. There's no doubt that strong men, and they are all men currently, as Thierry said, they are on the move. They have a sense that maybe this is their moment, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, or for that matter, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, probably another good example of the strongman style of leadership. But we're seeing in the democracies as well a preference in some countries for strongman leadership. Viktor Orban in Hungary. We've got Modi in India, definitely leading in a strongman style. And obviously President Erdogan in Turkey, re-elected again, very much with this strongman style. And we have populist parties echoing some of this style rising in other European countries as well. I think some of this is driven by weaknesses and insecurities in democracy. We can come to that maybe later, Dr. Choi. But I think we need to just remind ourselves about the nature of autocracies. They inevitably become more autocratic. If you have one person leading a country and there is no chance of a change in leadership, all the people around that leader start to tell him, and it is generally him, that what they're doing is right. They don't criticize. They worry about their own survival. So you lose the capacity for criticism, for change, and autocratic governments tend to become more autocratic rather than simply remain stable. The paranoia that comes with being an autocratic leader becomes more paranoid. And again, we might want to come back to that later on with some of the examples. I'd say another dimension, though, is the sense amongst autocracies that this is their moment because the democracies are weak. When Donald Trump moved to a very firm version of America first, in a way he was saying, we as American leaders don't really care about the rest of the world right now. What we care about is trying to make ourselves strong again. And that made America's allies feel insecure. And it created an opening, in a way, for strongman leadership. They recognized in Donald Trump, I think, some of themselves. He certainly used a lot of the same language about how international order should operate, the dominance of state sovereignty, etc. There is a sense at the moment that there's an alternative to US leadership. And in the end, strongmen need to be fed from the outside. They can't just get enough legitimacy inside. Strongmen need an enemy, or they need an international environment that explains that their way is the right way. And Western weakness, which is certainly what we saw, let's say, in the late 2015s, 16s, 17s, even in the early 2020s, I think gave them a certain amount of sense of hope for the future. We will discover, I think Ukraine has changed the picture for strongmen. And maybe I should stop there, Dr. Choi, because I think you want to come back to that point later on.
Thank you. Really appreciate. Actually, I'd like to ask the second question about because Sir Robin has already mentioned about the weakness and strengths of authoritarian regime. But on the other hand, I like to ask the same question, and weaknesses and the strengths of a democratic society. Ironically, it seems to me that the Ukraine war enlightened the coalition building capacity among democratic countries by creating the common fear, common threat among all European countries at the same time. Now, Sweden finally joined NATO, and Finland. The expansion of democratic countries and coalition building are going on. So I like to ask the same question, but if there's no such thing, what would happen to EU? Actually, we experienced, Sir John, Sir Robin, because actually I hate to raise the question of the Brexit, but actually Brexit was the first actually sign of breaking the EU solidarity among themselves. It was followed by other countries, so we have so many problems, but also maybe apply to the French leadership, because actually we used to have 3 strong countries, leaders in EU or NATO, France, UK, and Germany. But now we have only 2. How we are going to stand against the rise of this authoritarian and strong leaders, not actually men, but strong leaders, and what are the more fundamental problems of actually related to the question, what are the more fundamental challenges we have to deal with these strong leaders in authoritarian regime? And maybe Mr. Montbrial?
Yes, because unfortunately the British are no longer members of the European Union. So let me say first that I agreed with almost everything Robin said, except one. I do not believe that authoritarian leaders necessarily tend to become more autocratic. And and the problem is that we do not distinguish enough among the great variety of what we call strong men or strong leaders. I come back to Lee Kuan Yew. Now, Lee Kuan Yew, maybe the younger generation doesn't have the name of Lee Kuan Yew in mind, but Lee Kuan Yew was the great strong leader of Asia. He gave you know, the example to everybody was referring to him until his death about 10 years ago. And he prepared his succession. So it so happens that the current Prime Minister of Singapore is his son, but his son is very bright and he was actually elected. So we should look at this issue of strong people in a more nuanced way. Now, and also when he says, he being Robin, strong men need an enemy, etc., well, again, I made the distinction, I put the question in my initial remarks about efficiency. You know, a regime has to deliver. He has to deliver, that is, he has to make decisions, he has to set goals and to reach the goals. And over time, he's judged on that. It's a credibility problem. And that's precisely the weakness of democracy. And here you will allow me, Chairman, to make a point where I represent a minority on Ukraine. Ukraine, you said that we in Europe, we reacted together and so forth and so on. But we just followed the situation. We did not act, and we still don't act strategically. We just have one idea. We follow what Ukraine asked, what President Zelensky asked us, but we do not have a clear-minded strategy. We repeat, okay, Russia should lose the war. Lose the war, meaning they should just evacuate the whole of occupied territories, including Crimea. Is this, frankly speaking, is this a strategic goal? Do you really believe? I was reading this morning also the papers, the newspapers about the current visit of Kim Jong-un in Russia, and I read many columnists writing that maybe South Korea will be forced at some point to deliver weapons and so forth and so on to Ukraine as a kind of automatic reaction to the current events. Is this kind of moves, is this strategic thinking? I don't think so. So I think that the problem we all have is, I repeat it again, is efficiency. That's the big problem of democracy. So I suggest that we discuss this issue of efficiency more. I make another point that will probably hurt some of you. I think that the European Union is actually in a vital risk in the next 10 to 20 years. Why? Because as a consequence of this lack of strategic thinking, we have embarked on further enlargements that we will be obliged to do because the leaders will be pushed to do it unless they are strong enough to resist the natural forces. And if they do that, the European Union will become even more heterogeneous than it is today, and totally it will be impossible to govern it in an efficient way. So there is a vital risk on the European Union itself, and that's a part, to some extent, of the Ukrainian war. And if that happens, and if Russia is able to continue to occupy the territories or some territories in Ukraine, then we could say perhaps that at the end of the day, the Russians have won.
I'm proud of what the democracies have done vis-a-vis Putin and his invasion of a sovereign neighbor. I'm proud of it because democracies came together, and as I've said elsewhere, the unintended consequences of what Mr. Putin did was to make NATO stronger than it's been in the last 50 years.
Yes.
With new members, we've all heard here at this very conference from the former Prime Minister of Finland, who told me privately, I think he said it also publicly in his session, that before February of last year, before the Russian invasion, something like 7% of the Finnish population were in favor of Finland joining NATO. Within 30 days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that number was up to 70%, and Finland immediately applied, was accepted, and became an active member of NATO. And beyond that, and here I will give, frankly, I'll give some real credit to President Trump. Beyond that, one of the things Trump emphasized when he came in and talked about NATO was, hey, don't just rely on the United States bailing all of Europe out. Europe, you have to do your share too, which means you all abide by the 2% of GDP being spent on defense that NATO has had as their target now for 15 years. And during Trump's administration, the number of countries in NATO that were doing that went from 4 to, I think, 11 or 12. So people were getting the message, and I think after Ukraine, even more of them have gotten the message. And a piece in the FT, I think yesterday or the day before, about what Sweden is doing, a new nominee for NATO, what Sweden is doing in terms of increasing its defense budget by like 50% in the immediate future. You know, Sweden has 1,000 or 1,200 miles of land border with Russia, and they have to be worried about that.
Okay, I fully agree with that. But actually, I like the same question to Sir Robin, especially about your perspective on the Ukraine war. It seems to me that Ukraine war is kind of a litmus test for democratic resilience, how long and how strong we can stand together in achieving the ultimate goal. But it seems to me there is no consensus about this, the ultimate goal in doing the things on Ukraine. Maybe fear of escalation, because when President Putin alluded that maybe we can use a tactical nuclear weapon. Correct me if I'm wrong, because actually Russia has deployed a tactical nuclear weapon back in Belarus that creates some kinds of imbalance in nuclear parity or maybe strategic landscape. So how we are going to respond to the challenges, actually military challenges, that's the first question. Second, actually, the Ukraine crisis has shed the lights on more fundamental problems like a food supply or other supply chains. Is it possible for us to build more resilient, recoverable supply chain regionally and globally? Please.
Well, thank you for those two questions. On Ukraine first, I am much more positive. I'm not going to say optimistic. I'm much more positive about what we have been doing. I think you can say the West, because it's principally the United States and Europe, vis-a-vis Ukraine. Just because it's complicated and slow doesn't mean it's right. And Thierry, I think there's no point being homogenous next to chaos. I'm a big believer that Zbigniew Brzezinski was kind of right when you said that power abhors a vacuum. The problem, in a way, Ukraine was in a vacuum. And over time, inevitably, because of the insecurities of the Russian regime, Vladimir Putin, Ukraine had to belong to one side or the other. The idea that it would sit in the middle in some type of stasis, I think was not credible strategically. Do we have a goal? The goal is for Ukraine to survive as a sustainably sovereign state where the people can choose their future, where Ukraine has not been absorbed into a sphere of influence of an insecure and more autocratic and violent Russia. Because in the end, if Ukraine were to be inside Russia, which was Vladimir Putin's plan, then it would become Poland or Slovakia or the Baltics that would then be the next ones that would be the arc of insecurity. And we would just end up having to create a new front line somewhere else. I think that the way this war has been managed has been intelligent. It has been a bit brutal and ruthless. We have said no to weapons that maybe in some cases, if they'd been supplied earlier, would have been better, but I agree completely with Ed Feulner. A lot of the equipment could not have been used and would arrive too late to be able to make a difference. But when we look to the long term and try to be strategic about this, Ukraine, and I heard a very good French analyst actually describe this, François Isbourg, there is a kind of this idea, will it end up with a Korea scenario? Will we end up with some type of armistice line? It looks like it's impossible for Ukrainian forces to completely take back all of the territory they lost, not just in 2014, but even after February 24th, 2022. But the parallels there, I think, are not particularly strong. Because Ukraine is connected to the rest of Europe, and you're going to have to think about its future in a much more integrated way. The Germany scenario in the Cold War strikes me as probably where the strategy that no one is saying, but we know is there underneath the surface, is going to emerge, which is to say that we have to wait for the moment where Zelensky can consider negotiating. He is a democratic leader. Accurate polling right now in Ukraine has in fact, the numbers are over 90% of Ukrainians say they want to keep fighting and fight to take everything back. So the idea that you can say to Zelensky, oh, do a compromise, we'll find a way to do it, he would be overthrown. You'd end up with a far more extreme kind of leadership in Ukraine. So we've got to give space for them to fight. They are the ones who are dying. We have been very strategic in saying he's not a member of NATO. We will not physically send forces in. I think we've been very good at de-emphasizing the nuclear side on the Russian side by very clearly saying if you do use nuclear weapons, then the conventional riposte, by NATO included, will be huge. In other words, that will be treated as a reason for NATO to become involved, or Western governments at least to become involved at a conventional level. And I think the support with China and India as well has blocked that for the moment. So I think that's going well. But we will end up, in the end, with a situation where Ukraine, I hope, in the long term, will be a member of NATO and the EU. In the long term, It might take 5, 10, 15 years. It'll be difficult for the EU. It'll be difficult for NATO. America has to give the security guarantee. But in the end, I think we will be there, and it will be like Germany and West Germany, because then Zelensky will be able to say, I give up the vision of unification for now, yeah, because I am joining a group of countries that will protect our divided country for, who knows, 10, 20, 30 years, and maybe like Germany at some point in the future will reunify. They probably won't in their case, but at least that would give him the legitimacy to be there. And I would rather have a Ukraine inside NATO and inside the EU than have it be, as many people say, an Israel in Europe. A country that, hey, might try to get its own nuclear weapons, that will be doing provocations to attack Russia at any particular point. You'd be worse off having a kind of Israel-style Ukraine in the middle of Europe. But most interesting, it's visible in the emergence of the G7 as a nucleus around which you can fight a non-military Cold War. And in a way, I very much hope the G7 becomes a G9. In essence, Australia and South Korea are already participants and members of that G7. It is critical that Korea is a member of it. We will not have secure supply chains in the West without South Korea involved on the battery provision, so we don't have to rely on China, on semiconductor development, so we don't have to rely as much in the future on Taiwan. I mean, you know, it is essential that we build up economic resilience, not only against the Russian threat, but in the long term, we cannot create the dependencies that Europe created with Russia with China. And the G7 plus G9, I think, is part of the answer to that. It includes the EU, it includes Britain, it includes Canada, obviously, and the US and Japan, but importantly, Australia and South Korea. Sorry, it's a long answer, but big question.
Thank you. Actually, I strongly support South Korea should join the G7 along with Australia, maybe New Zealand.
Yeah,
as
New
well.
Zealand can, yeah,
Because
politics.
actually we have some standard applying for the acceptance of candidates in G7. But actually, Mr. Mongbui, I know you like to respond back to Sir Robin. Please.
Well, in fact, you know, if the scenario of Robin where, let's say, I had a 70% chance of being achieved, I would agree with him. But I think this development is a kind, if I may say so, it's an act of faith on the kind of Western ideology that existed until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, I base this on three points. No, one is, I mentioned the Crimea War of the 19th century earlier. Russia was defeated. It was defeated, but relatively soon after, they recovered. They had a Minister of Foreign Affairs who was a remarkable man whose name was Gorchakov, not Gorbachev, but Gorchakov. And Gorchakov used to say, Russia is never as strong or as weak as it looks. And I think this is Bismarck. Bismarck thought a lot about this remark of Gorchakov. And I think that during the Soviet times, we overestimated the Soviet Union. And I think that we may be underestimating Russia today with or without Putin. And the question is, how long will Russia, I say Russia, I don't say Putin, how long will they be able to fight this war in Ukraine and to hold territories? You know, if in the next 10 years or so, they are militarily able to hold the occupied territories, that will be a totally different scenario as the West, they say, winning, or Ukraine winning, kicking out the Russians entirely from these occupied territories. So that's one point. The second question we should address is why please, why, we don't have time to do that in this session, but why does the rest, you know, when the East, the West, and the rest, why does the rest not follow the West? You know, in the United Nations, look at Modi, you know, the concept of multi-alignment. I think that this is the key word. You know, most countries in the world today want to be multi-aligned. They do not side with us, you know. Why does Lula, why does Modi and so many others do not recognize the aggression, which is an aggression? I fully agree with that. But they do not recognize that it was a Russian aggression. Let us think about it. And my last remark is, well, I followed some of the sessions in this remarkable World Knowledge Forum. And I remember on the first day, the discussion about artificial intelligence, especially on ChatGPT and about generative artificial intelligence. And the best minds, researchers, said the future is in this respect totally unpredictable. We are talking, was it going to happen in 10 years? But in 10 years, the world will be totally different from what it is today. And whatever we say, Robin, myself, whoever, Edwin, you will immediately have people on the nets who will say, no, it's wrong. The reality is different. The fake news will govern the world. This is one of the most likely hypotheses. So we should be very cautious when we have such a complex situation that can degenerate any day. We have to keep in mind that the world is full of unpredictabilities, of uncertainties, as we discussed in the forum since in the last 3 days.
Thank you. But actually, that brings me the question on China, because actually the area that we will see the intense competition is about the US, China on AI, quantum computing, and semiconductors. Whether all those three technologies will impact fundamentally, seriously about this. But actually, it seems to me that especially, I went to China last week, so I assume that actually digital authoritarian control is gaining the momentum in China. So actually, whether these all the emerging technology will benefit democratic regimes or authoritarian regimes, that's the question we have to address. At the moment, actually, they are pouring lots of financial resources and manpower in developing these new emerging technology ahead of the other competing countries. So what is your hunch on this, the consequences or possible consequences of this, the emerging technologies on this, the authoritarian, the leadership, strong leadership? Please, maybe Dr. Feulner?
As Theory just said, projecting the future is a dangerous occupation. But what concerns me is that bad developments could outweigh the benefits that we see. That doesn't mean we're going to stop it. It's going to happen in any event. And when I've listened to people from this very stage over the last 2 days talk about, well, as AEI evolves, we will have to regulate it. And I think to myself, wow, regulate it. Who's going to decide who does the regulating? Who's going to decide what the regulations are? It's not going to be the United States acting unilaterally. It's not going to be the attendees here deciding it among ourselves. And then, once there is a decision made on what kind of regulation you're going to have to make sure that it stays basically honest, the question then is, who watches the watchers? This is a long-time philosophical question. You put somebody in charge of doing the regulating, who watches that group of people who do the regulating?
Strongmen. The strongmen.
Strongmen. Who's that? Who's that? Putin, Kim Jong-un,
Whoever.
Yeah. So, these are really big issues that I don't see a clear, easy answer to. I wish I could. Let me just add one more footnote in terms of Ukraine, Russia, etc. When we talk about Ukraine going on for such a long period of time, at what stage is it conceivable that there will be internal Russian reaction at both the loss of life of some of the finest young people on the battlefront and a loss of economic security at home because of the worldwide sanctions that are being kind of uniformly put in place, and the reaction that I'm sure the Russian people are starting to hear independently of state media. These factors, again, who can really measure? I don't know, but it's not all on Mr. Putin's side.
Okay, Robin?
Well, let me come to your question about digital authoritarianism in a second, but just quickly picking up on the back of Ed's comment just there. It strikes me that Russia is not alone, sadly, and it's not just because Xi Jinping is with him. I very much agree with Thierry. I think this has been the perfect moment. The coming together of China and Russia around Ukraine, and the coming together of the Atlantic and Pacific partnerships around America is the perfect moment for the so-called global South to triangulate between the two sides. They don't really care. Lula doesn't care whether, it's not about democracy or autocracy for him. It's a matter of not being subject to American hegemony. I was in Beijing myself a couple of months ago. I heard Dilma Rousseff, who's now the former president and is now president of the National Development Bank, of the BRICS Bank, as it was called. Her speech there was the most anti-American speech that I heard in my whole week in Beijing. So, it is not about democracies versus autocracies. What has happened is that we have given space, actually, to the strongmen to triangulate. Modi can be stronger because he can play Russia on the one hand and he can play the West on the other, and the same goes for Erdogan, the same goes for everyone. Triangulation gives space for the strong men to be able to do more than they could before. So I think they are, sadly, in some ways benefiting from this. But I was struck, I hadn't been to China for 4 years probably, late 2019 or something like that, the last time. And it did strike me that China, apart from the fact that it was empty of anyone that looked like me, I walked around Beijing for 4 hours one afternoon, did not see a single one Western face. Now this was early July. I'm sure it's changing. China's opening a bit more travel happening, but still, I have a sense the country is becoming more self-referential. And to my mind, there's no doubt that he, as everyone talks about him, is using the technology that was being rolled out in the social credit system to now, in a way, allow the Chinese Communist Party to get citizens to police themselves and to manage the country. Now, just because China is successful for now as an autocracy doesn't mean that others will be able to use it as well. This, as Ed said, and I think Thierry said as well, this is a battle that we do not know the front lines of. I am Gramscian in this sense. I can be very, pessimistic when I look at things, but I'm optimist of the will. I think the very fact that the greatest AI inventions are emerging from the democratic chaos of America is a sign of hope for the future. And I think in most cases, there is an opportunity here for greater disaggregation of power through AI than concentration of power, in most cases, yeah? I'm not saying for China. It's very efficient at being authoritarian. It has thousands of years to work on.
Mr. Montbrial.
Yes. Well, it happens, for me to agree with Robin. We have been friends for so many years. The problem is that, again, the term democracy is very ill-defined. Of course, democracy will prevail, but what does it mean? So, but there always will be also autocrats, etc., depending on the historical context. Well, on the question you raised, I would say very briefly that technologies can be good for either side. It depends on the circumstances. Robin mentions blockchains. Blockchains are good for anyone who wants to hide something. That includes, of course, the autocrats and the strong people. On technology, I am very much impressed by the fact that some countries and strong men are able to achieve a lot with very little means, resources, particularly when the rich try to interdict access to them, access of sensitive technologies to them. For instance, Kim Jong-un, North Korea, has achieved in the military technology quite remarkable things. In fact, well, quite remarkable things. Russia did a lot. And they are very good at achieving with very little possibilities. So we have to be careful. And last remark I would like to make, because time is going on, is on the internal situation in Russia. This is something some institutions like mine are following very, very closely with very good people. After the October Revolution in 1917, many people left the country, but the Soviet Union existed for 70 years and more with some results. Now, a number of people are leaving, but the rest of the country, is very likely to follow the leader, whoever he is. And we do not see any sign, and I'm talking those who observe very closely, any side of anything like a rebellion so the Russian people will probably, in that sense, remain passive. I prefer to stop here because.
Okay, thank you. Before we're concluding, I'd like to ask you, because actually these are the leaders of think tank, role of think tank in this turbulent world.
What is the question, sorry?
The role of think tank in this
the role?
Yeah, roles of think tank, contribution we can make.
I think, I don't know what my colleagues would say on this, I think the problem is that the fragmentation of the world make it more difficult today to have frank and open discussions among think tanks, as we used to have. About 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it was possible to have quite open discussions, for instance, with the Chinese, or of course with the Russians. We have developed very good, close relations with many of these think tanks. Today, it is still possible to have a lot of discussions. Even with Russians today, we maintain contacts. And with China, we have many contacts, but they are much more formal, and I would say the think tanks tend to be more instrumental in some countries, and this is a big concern if we want the think tanks to play also their role as a facilitator at the wide international level.
Not only as a facilitator in terms of those kinds of conversations, but as an independent one.
Exactly.
Independent of the internal structure or independent of the world structure, if you will, really, to have a dissenting voice often. And this is something that we've learned, and we hear it certainly in terms of government agencies too. An intelligence agency should not just have one position. They should have somebody over there arguing the opposite side. Yeah. If somebody says, because of what Russia did in Ukraine, Russia's whole military future is suspect, somebody else should be waiting and say, wait a minute, they've learned a lot from this and it could be stronger. So that's kind of the role that a think tank should be able to play and do it effectively, both nationally and internationally, and that's why it's so good to come together here with counterpart organizations and talk very candidly and publicly about how we can work together to promote those ideas.
Last but least, so John, so Robin.
Just 4 things very quickly. As think tanks, I think keep looking to the future, because the present overwhelms us and we mustn't get caught up just in commentating on today, which is very tempting. we are privileged to be part of civil society in democratic countries. So that comes with responsibility. Speak the truth, hire people who are willing to seek the truth. And that brings me to my third point: be provocative. Don't, just do the conventional wisdom. And lastly, be accessible. Because I think we've all discussed here, if we talk to ourselves, we'll be overwhelmed by all of the noise that is emerging. And as Ed said at the beginning of this panel, there's more and more noise. So we need to be accessible. We need to find ways to get our ideas out, to use the technologies that are available to make sure that they're accessible to people who want to access the truth and to be able to look to the future.
Thank you. I would not wrap up but actually I'd like to join you in thanking these three great leaders of think tank for their
Strongmen.
but wise. Okay, please join me in thanking for their contribution and sharing their thought with us. Thank you.